What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Space Arena Ground Arena. Tonight we have a very special guest joining us tonight. We have I believe it was Columbus PQ winner, Sam, with us, and he's going to talk about his Quinlan Voss Tarkin Town deck that he piloted to an undefeated Swiss finish. Didn't drop a game in Swiss and only dropped one game in all of his matches of Top Cut. So it was a very impressive run. Congratulations and thanks for joining me once again for another deck tech after a good run.
Thanks. Yeah, it's good to be back talking with you. And not just because these videos are highly correlated to me doing well in events.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll get right into it. We're going to talk about Quinlan Voss, obviously. If I can click on the right thing here. So the agenda, everybody can see it. We'll go over the overview of the deck at like 1,000-foot view. We'll talk about the leader a little bit, the general game plan with Quinlan, some interesting card choices that you have in here versus the more, we'll say, stock list, some general play lines, and then we're going to talk about the turn 1 Tarkin Town dance and how to sideboard when piloting your version.
Sounds good.
So here's the 60 cards you played in Columbus. It's a pretty general Quinlan Tarkin Town deck. So
yeah, I think there's a few choices we'll talk about, but for the most part, I think like 50 of these 60 cards are pretty standard in Quinlan these days, wherever it pops up.
Agreed. Alrighty, so talking about Quinlan Voss, what interests you about playing Quinlan Voss? What drew you to him as a leader?
It's interesting because I actually, in the set 3 pre-release, I played a Quinlan Voss deck. In the first pre-release I went to, and I was like, yeah, I think this leader's overhyped. I think he's going to be very good.
And then you won a PQ.
Yeah. So, it was a journey to Quinlan Voss. But, obviously, we are just in this world now of all sorts of pinging damage leaders. It seems like there's even more pinging damage leaders coming in set 4. That Tarkin Town base just pairs really well with leaders that ping damage out.
Yeah. So I played a lot of Cad Bane from set 2 and into set 3, and I see Quinlan as like the hero version of that, but it's a little better because you can pick where the damage goes. It's not random. And also him deploying on 5 and being a force unit also opens up a lot of other cool possibilities.
Yeah, for sure. That's a good comparison. Quinlan definitely, I feel like, plays a little more aggressive than Cad does, especially early on. But yeah, similar kind of idea of exploiting Tarkin Town to get ahead on board and then kind of closing the game out with disruption.
Yeah, Quinlan does a much better job overall with the disruption part. Cad mainly just has Bazine. But yeah, so we'll get into it. So the floor is yours. Let's talk about the general game plan of Quinlan Voss.
You didn't trick me into a Cad Bane video, I hope.
He is my favorite Star Wars character, so,
Yeah, I'm not qualified to talk about Cad. But yeah, I think what we have here is pretty much the Quinlan gameplay. I think of Quinlan as it's like a pretty like fair deck overall. I mean, it kind of is like a skill test deck a little bit, in that you kind of sit down against any deck and have, basically an even matchup. I feel like, there's not that many top meta decks that are like scared of Quinlan Voss, I don't think. But then also there's no decks that like sit down across from Quinlan and it's like, oh yeah, this is an easy matchup for me. So I don't know, it's kind of like you feel like you have a chance in every game, but you don't feel like this is an easy win in any game kind of thing. But yeah, in general, like you're trying to be, I think, but at least the way I have the deck constructed, aggressive early. That's setting up the board disruption, and then using your hand disruption spells primarily, like Force Throw, Spark of Rebellion, Kira, like kind of the heart of the deck, to basically just stop your opponent from doing what they want to do, messing with them a lot, and then pushing damage through. A lot of that is the ambush plays from Plo Koon that turn into damage, and then the smuggle, hotshot blaster, and surprise strike kind of plays that push a lot of damage through in the end game.
Yeah. Mess with your opponent, win the board, and push damage.
Pretty
Sounds
straightforward,
good.
pretty easy, right?
Yeah, it's super easy. So some card choices that not a lot of people have in their Quinlan lists, but you have them in yours.
Yeah, for sure. So we'll go through them in order. I guess we'll start with Greedo. So I've had Greedo in my Quinlan list probably since December. I think it wasn't in a lot of the first couple Quinlan decks that became popular online. I feel like from doing well in some of the early showdowns or some of the early PQs, the first couple weeks of PQ season, didn't really have any one cost units in them. And I know recently people have kind of been switching to putting one cost units in to Quinlan a little bit, because that became a popular turn one thing about playing, R2D2 or something to try and dodge turn one Quinlan ping. But I feel like, a lot of people have been talking about, Soldier of the First or some other one drops you could potentially put in here. And I feel like the theory behind that is the 1 health on Greedo makes him vulnerable to other decks pinging you. But for the most part, I haven't been that worried about it. For one thing, the two best decks, quote unquote best decks so far through PQ season have been Sabine and Han. And neither of those decks have a ping effect. And Greedo is actually very good against both those decks. He trades with all of the Sabine units that they can play early on. And, he threatens more damage than any of the other options people have been talking about. And he also works really well in combination with the second card on this list, Leia, to set up some potential turn one go wide strategies, which is something that Quinlan wants to do in certain matchups. So there are a couple decks, obviously, where Greedo is not great early on, primarily Cad Bane, right? Cad Bane just gets to kill him for free, basically. And Django has the potential to do that if they have an ISB agent or a P38 ready to kind of eliminate him for free. But, there's a whole wide range of decks out there. Not all of them are Django and Cad Bane. So you got to kind of, make some choices about playing the percentages of what you're going to see. And given the popularity of Han and Sabine, I think Greedo is fine in the 1-drop slot. He advances the deck's kind of early aggression game plan better than the alternatives, I would say.
I'll just say I agree. And you were on Quinlan way before anybody else in our group was. I spent a lot of time on Han and Cad, but was playing Quinlan, I don't know, more than the other guys in our group. And I basically copied your list, so I've always had Greedo in as well. Just because, so I noticed so many people trying to, like you said, dodge the turn one ping by playing a 1-drop. So he fits that role really well.
Yep. All right. So then if we move on to the second card here, Leia. Leia is probably the most recent change that we made in our, in our little play group, or that I made even right before this tournament. And it kind of, I know, again, going back to some of the early Quinlan lists, Grogu was a pretty popular inclusion, which I know I was never very excited about playing Grogu, basically for the reason that, yes, he does have some good utility, but he doesn't really get your pressure started, which is what you want to do. And Leia offers kind of some of the same effect that Grogu does, but in a much more versatile way in the testing that, or in the games that I've played with her. So late, if you draw her at the kind of the late game, she does some of the stuff that you want Grogu to do, just exhaust a triple dark raid unit or a Han leader deploy to kind of stall your opponent. But in the early game, she enables some cool turn 1 and turn 2 plays where you get to play multiple cards a turn using her resource ready ability. So, you can like start a turn 1 with Leia plus Greedo, Leia plus Daring Raid, or turn 2, like if you play a normal unit on turn 1, and then turn 2 you set up like Leia plus Spark of Rebellion with the
Mm-hmm.
with the resource ready, which is a really strong turn 2 sometimes, because you add additional units and pressure to the board while also getting to, start playing your disruption. Your disruption offers a lot of versatility all throughout, from turn 1 and turn 2 to some of the later turns where you're trying to just kind of slow or stall your opponent while you get your final, points of damage across. So she's been a really good addition to the deck, and I think I much prefer having kind of a toolbox option compared to something like Grogu that is fine at the one thing he does, but isn't offering you quite the same versatility that Leia does.
Yeah, 100%. That's the same conclusion I came to also. I get it. It makes sense. And yeah, that Leia, I've already, in some games on Carabas, hit like the turn 2 Leia into Spark and ripped like a resupply. Like, and then they, claim the first action next turn because they have nothing to do then, as well. So, yeah, there's some good plays you can set up there.
Yep. It's pretty nice. All right, so then if we jump on to Ahsoka Tano. Ahsoka is just a one of in the deck list I played in Columbus. And I think we included here because like people probably look at that deck list like, well, why aren't you just playing 3 Cassian or, a 3 of something else? And I guess I would say there's kind of 2 defenses I'll provide for Ahsoka Tano's inclusion. One is her type of being a force unit. And, you know, ignoring everything else, Quinlan is a force throw deck. So especially once you take the Grogu's out, your force units are Ezra Bridger, Plo Koon, and then your leader. And most of the time, like if you are holding your force throw to leader deploy, it's fine. I mean, you kind of want to play it for the most part when your opponent just has 1 or 2 cards left, so you're getting high value cards off of it. But sometimes you need it a turn earlier, and having a 3-cost force unit is good for that reason. And the second, so number 1 is turns on force throw. Number 2 is if you look at my deck list, you'll notice every single unit except for Green Squadron A-Wing is a unique unit. And I think when you're playing an entire deck of unique units, it's not necessarily bad to do splits, like 2-1 splits or 2-2 splits at
Mm-hmm.
certain costs in your curve, just to avoid problematic scenarios where you have 2 of the same thing and can't cast anything. So just, as a diversity mechanism, I really don't mind like playing Ahsoka as a 1-of in the 3-drop slot. She gets resourced a lot, but when you need to play her as a force unit to turn on force throw, like having her as emergency kind of 4th pseudo Ezra Bridger has been good for me.
I think that makes total sense, especially when you bring up the point about the unique units. The one point you did bring up that I think we should touch on Grogu that we skipped over is he's also a force unit. So that is one of the boons of Grogu, is that he turns on a turn 1. You can't play it turn 1, but turn 1 you have a force unit for force throw.
Yep, for sure. That is one of the benefits. And yeah, making that switch from Grogu to Leia, like I said, that kind of, I was on the fence about Ahsoka, but then I was like, no, I think I want to at least leave one Ahsoka in here just to have that additional force trait available.
Yeah, that makes sense. You want to make it more consistently have it when you need it. So having another force unit on turn 2 makes a lot of sense.
Yep. All right. Well, then I guess let's go to the last card on this list, Mr. Poe Dameron. Poe has not had a place in a lot of Quinlan lists. And I get it. Like for the most part, in most games, you're gonna prefer Plo Koon for the ambush effect, the combination with Quinlan specifically that you get to deploy Quinlan, which for the most part turns on coordinate for your Plo ambush to take out a lot of enemy leaders, that kind of thing. So I get it. Like I'm not here to say like oh cut Plo Koon and play Poe Dameron instead. But you only get 3 Plo Koons in your deck. And sometimes you're not gonna draw one. Or sometimes you're going to play one, but then your opponent's going to have an answer for it, and you're going to need some other way to end the game. And there's not really many better finisher options than Poe for his costs and stats, especially when you consider that hopefully when you're playing him, you've already played some disruption cards like Force Throw or Spark or Kira to create an opening where you have, kind of like a time window to get Poe on the board and hopefully get an attack off without your opponent having an answer for him.
Yeah.
So, he just closes the game harder and faster than some of the other top end options that are out there, like playing more Big Falcons or Han units or Emphys Nest or, whatever people are considering for Quinlan Voss.
Yeah, I mean, he surprise strikes for 11, so you can just end the game out of nowhere. They feel safe. Oh, I got 11 damage. I'm kind of safe, and then bam, there's 11 in your face. So, and he is versatile in with his ability. So, if you're playing into like the boss decks, or like you're playing against a Sabine that has a dark saber, you got a way to eliminate those upgrades. And he can also push the disruption angle too. If your opponent has one card in hand yet, and like when you saw Kira that they had like a Snoke and a Super Laser Blast or something, and they, you hit it with Poe now, they got, you killed their option to clear the board. So,
Yep, for sure. Poe ended several games during the course of the weekend for me, so I don't know. I don't really have any regrets about including Poe Dameron in this deck list. I think he is just good on his own.
so this doesn't have anything to do with it kind of has something to do with Columbus, but how different is this version of Quinlan from the one you played at the Winna case or whatever it was we did, or the Winna
The thing
box?
that we did in PA,
Yeah.
it's a bit different. That version,
Like I remember you had Poe in that one too, but
yeah, and that was like before. So when we did that event, I still had Pillage's main too, because that was still like kind of before the demise of Bosk Blue. Like it was pretty soon after that big European event, and everybody was like, "Oh, Bosk Blue is like the boogeyman
mhm,
or whatever." So that version had like the Corvettes and Pillages that I've moved to the sideboard since then, which I
got
know
it.
we're going to talk about sideboard coming up. And now has like some of these options like Leia, Poe, Greedo, right? These are slanted for these kind of like damage race matchups against like Han and Sabine rather than, some of those cards that you are going to bring in against control decks.
Makes sense. Just a question I had quick. But yeah, I get it. Makes sense. I like it. All right. Your main play lines versus your different matchups. So for aggro, match their drop, Tarkin Town, win the board, control, and push damage.
Yeah. I think, we were talking to one of our other buddies, Tony, about the aggro matchup, and I just kind of say like the same thing there. If we consider aggro as kind of code for Sabine right now, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Like the advantage of Tarkin Town is you get board presence early versus the advantage of like ECL is they get their kind of big damage spike play late. So you gotta kind of like lean into that for the most part in these matchups against aggro, right? And try to use your Tarkin Town to really get that early presence going and then time your disruption to try and stall or delay their like big damage spike finisher play and hopefully close the game out before they are able to pull it off. So it's kind of surprising because I think people think of Kira as like an anti-control card, but really I think Kira is best against more aggressive decks just because of, what she's doing to close the door on their attempt to like come back or damage ratio down the stretch. She just like closes off those avenues of victory for aggro so effectively.
Mm-hmm.
Really, like, I think this is one of the places that she really shines as compared to some of the other cards in her deck.
She's a lot harder to remove for them because they're not running removal. So they got to trade like 2 or 3 units into Kira if they want to clear it. And if you're hitting if you're calling Poe or Wrecker, yeah, like you said, you just close the door on them because they're not gonna have a way to finish.
Yep, exactly. It's like it's funny because like against control, Kira's just like a speed bump, but against aggro, she's like a game-winning play. And so, I mean, we'll talk about this when we get down to like, mid-range and control, but I'm much more likely to want to keep K2SO as my 4-cost play in those matchups than against aggro, where I would basically never keep K2, I don't think, over Kira in an aggro matchup.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, so what's your play strat versus mid range?
So mid-range is so broad, there's so
Mm-hmm.
much in there. But against mid-range, right, I think a lot of mid-range matchups come down to how effectively you're able to use these disruption things, which is not just Kira, more so like the sparks and force throws in this instance, because with mid-range, like it's not just about the damage race. Like if we just take all the variants of Han 1 and shove them in this kind of category, they're playing top end that will kind of effectively overtake the game if you let them get it down. So for instance, like Han Green, right? If they land like a reinforcement walker, it's pretty hard for you to deal with a reinforcement walker. Like you probably lost the game at that point. So you still need to get the early pressure going. Obviously, mid-range is going to try to stall you a little bit so they can get to these kind of like bigger top-end plays that they have. And that's where we have to like use our sparks and force throws smartly to basically buy ourselves time to close them out with our Plo Koons and our Poe Damerons, the Millennium Falcons, before they can kind of take over the board. And so, like, this is where force throw off of leader is fine, or Plo Koon is fine. Like, because you don't necessarily need force throw early. Like, if you draw it in your opening hand and you need other things to play, I think it'd be fine, I'd say, to resource that and wait until you get one later in the game when it's going to be higher impact. Because, between force throw and spark, like, if you go to resource 6 or 7, you're going to draw more than one of these. But you really need to make sure that you're utilizing them to hit the critical spells that are gonna, or the critical units or events or whatever that mid-range is gonna use to win the game. So you can't just use them as like tempo plays. Like, against aggro, you fire off a turn 1 spark. It's not always the worst thing if you like take their turn 1 away too and just like kind of delay the beginning of the game. But that's not usually as effective against mid-range because you're just playing into their hands if you do that. You really got to get pressure down and then use your disruption to make sure that they can't get to those finishers.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, control.
Yeah. So control, like we were talking about a minute ago, you kind of foreshadowed this. Like the deck now is not necessarily built with control in mind as much as it used to be. So a lot of it's in the sideboard with the pillages and the senatorial corvettes. But I've found the most effective way to play against control is to just try and make every single thing you do a 2-for-1 for them, right? Like you play a force unit and force throw them. You play a K2, that's 2 cards from your hand. You play a senatorial corvette, oh, that's 2 cards from your hand. Pillage you, that's 2 cards from your hand. Like basically every action you take can 2-for-1 them. And even against like boss that is potentially drawing like 4 extra cards if they hit a death mark on you or something, it's pretty hard to keep up with that like over the course of a game. I mean, eventually you are going to get them into top deck mode. And that, against control, if you get them into that position and you have, smuggle threats like Cassian and the ability to go wide with cheap units and like big finishers like Poe, I mean, you get them into top deck mode, eventually you're going to have hopefully a window to push enough damage through.
Yeah. Just got to get to 19 with Poe. Let's get him to 19. That's all you got to do.
Yep, exactly.
That all makes sense. I mean, the reason that Quinlan is a little different than other decks is how effective his disruption is. He is like the most effective disruption package that we've seen. So
yep, for sure.
It's just because it's more consistent, because a 5-drop force leader, right, that you can force throw earlier consistently just is. That's right. It's kind of why Chariot was so much play in set 1, because he was a force leader in set 1, that you could play earlier than all the other force leaders. But now you give him access to Spark of Rebellion. So it makes it even better.
Yep, absolutely.
The Tarkin Town dance, turn 1. Do we always want a Tarkin Town turn 1? When don't we? Let's talk about it.
Sure. Let's talk about it. So yeah, I think this is one of the things, especially when you're first learning Quinlan, or first trying to like figure it out on Carabas or whatever. It's like, oh, do I want initiative? Do I not want initiative? People are gonna like pass on you because they think like Quinlan wants to turn to Tarkin Town my turn 1 play. They're gonna do it every time. So you get into these games where people are like, first action pass. Ha ha ha, got you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, it really depends on the matchup. For the most part, I think when people try to be cute and dance around your turn 1 Tarkin Town play, they're mostly hurting themselves. For one, like you have here, you can spark them in response and a lot of times punish them pretty severely. So especially like decks that really care about this, like Anakin, for instance, I think Anakin's probably the biggest culprit of like, I must play this funny game and dance around you and not get my turn 1 Tarkin Town. Well, a lot of times if they do that and you spark them and punish them, it's just as good as Tarkin Town, because then you still have, like, they've done nothing, and then you still have Tarkin Town for Yoda or whatever they're going to drop next round. So it's pretty good. Spark of Rebellion, punishment. And then, against aggro, obviously against aggro, you want to hit Tarkin Town as soon as possible, and turn 1's great. I will say that, like we talked about here, Han and Sabine have, like, actions they can do to try and force you to not Tarkin Town right away. And again, for the most part, a lot of times they're just going to punish themselves. So like if Sabine pings you to start, you're like, okay, well, 6 of the cards that both of you are trying to play turn 1 are Sabine unit and A-Wing. And if you happen to both be holding the same one of those things, whoever plays it first is heavily advantaged in the game, right? Because you claim initiative and then you get to trade, and they don't trade back.
Right.
So it's actually pretty dangerous for Sabine, if they're on the initiative, to just be like, I'm going to try to dodge Tarkin Town and let you play out onto the board first and potentially create a disadvantageous trade for them. So that's one thing where, like, a lot of times you can punish Sabine trying to dance around. And similar with Han, like, a lot of times Han is first their first action is gonna be use Han ability and
Yep.
try to force you to put something on the board. And like obviously if you have Spark and you take the thing that they want to do, then you've kind of 2-for-1 them.
Big
So
time.
Han has to be careful about that. And even if you don't have Spark and you play something out, like let's say you play A-Wing and Han has Millennium Falcon, well you just pass through the turn one, and like if they use Falcon to hit your A-Wing, then you can still Tarkin Town Falcon and like have traded up basically.
Yeah, you still
And
2-for-1 them.
yeah, exactly. And even if they just go base, okay, well then you claim initiative, you get to attack first, and then you're gonna play a 3-drop the next turn to Tarkin Town Millennium Falcon anyway. So like they didn't really gain anything by dancing around Tarkin Town in that scenario. So, you know, there's some matchups where this matters, and probably jumping down to the fourth bullet point here. I think the biggest matchup where this little like Tarkin Town dance comes into play and has a big impact on the game is this Cad Bane matchup. But that's
Mhm.
mostly because like the Tarkin Town dance is Cad Bane's entire deck strategy. You know, like it's the plan A, plan B, and plan C of Cad Bane is to just like ping your stuff off the board. So
Yeah.
you kind of like are forced into doing this like pass dance. Who's gonna play a unit first kind of thing? Who's gonna get their pings off with Cad Bane? But other than that, like obviously you wanna put yourself in a position to hit Tarkin Town early because, like we said before, that's when it's most effective in a lot of these matchups to create the early advantage for yourself. But also, if you don't get it, like if people start dancing around with you, if you just play your play lines and use Tarkin Town when you get the opportunity, like for the most part, opponents are just going to hurt themselves trying to dance around it, I think.
Yeah, and in certain matchups, you know what their strategy is. So, like in Nahan, I saved Tarkin Town for Tekker DJ. You know, Daring Raid Tarkin Town is a clean sweep on that. In aggro decks, you know, like we said, we're usually trying to hit that turn one play. In the mid-range decks, I'm trying to look for something maybe in the 4 or 5 drop range that I can either Daring Raid in Tarkin Town or ping Daring Raid, like some combination of a 5 or 6 damage, and use Tarkin Town to finish off like a really impactful unit. And then it can into control. I don't know about you, but sometimes I don't use it. Depending what kind of control deck it is. Sometimes I'm hitting Sentinels with it to clear the path. That's probably the most you most use against control is getting just clearing the path of a stupid Sentinel unit.
Yeah, for sure. In some of those like slower control-y decks, you definitely those are scenarios where using it early is less like the slower the deck you're playing against is, the less impactful using Tarkin Town early is going to be. And there, if you can save it as the follow-up for a force throw play, then I think that's where it becomes most effective because you turn your force throw into like an actual remove a giant threat for 1 cost card.
That's probably like the best way to deal with Snoke with this deck out of the main board is the force throw something into yeah.
Yeah, because Snoke is if they get to Snoke, it is a problem. Like it'll turn off pretty much your whole deck.
Yeah. Yeah, so you got to be able to clear them effectively, and with the main board, force throw into Tarkin Town's the best option because if they're holding Snoke, right, if you're on 8 resources, they have something else pretty big that they're probably going to have to throw at him. So, and that might even be a spot where you throw your own unit into Snoke so that you know you can clear the path. Like I'll throw Cassian at Snoke to Tarkin Town him, you know, like I got no problem doing that.
Yep, for sure.
All right, that's the Tarkin Town dance.
There it is.
Sideboard. Here's the stuff in your sideboard. I think Waylay and Bamboozle are one ofs and everything else was a 2 of.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess let's start with the easy one, Pillage and Corvette. We kind of talked about those already in the control. Like those are anti-control tech. Um, I played Boss Green once at Columbus, and it was like in the 5-0 match, so it was like kind of low stakes, honestly, because we had top 8 secured. I did not side pillage into that matchup, but I could easily see siding pillage in to ramp decks. I think it kind of depends on like your feel of how the ramp deck is built and like how the specific player is playing. And pillage is obviously often very good into decks that are trying to just hold one or two big threats. So if you don't really consider green, red, ramp control, I would say pillage is also good in that matchup. Waylay and Bamboozle are more in the aggro tempo kind of matchups that we talked about. Like, I think you could easily have either of these cards or both of them main deck, just based on, your meta read if you're expecting a lot of Sabine, Django, what else? Han, right? Like these are kind of your tempo war cards a lot of times against those sorts of decks. Um, yeah. Bamboozle is even decks that like are smuggling hotshot blasters at you. Like that's one of Han's best ways to win the game, right? Obviously, Bamboozle doesn't answer the initial attack, but it's still, decent even on the untap if you get to like bamboozle their hotshot blaster back to their hand and keep that unit from defeating you. It has some utility there.
I found Bamboozle's pretty good against Anakin decks.
Yeah, that's a good call out too. Yeah, because they're pretty much trying to slap lightsabers on stuff.
Yeah. Or the Force is with me, and like, Obi-Wan Sentinel buffing, like it's a way to get rid of tokens and all kinds of stuff. So
Yeah, it's a good toolbox card. I could easily see going up to 2 bamboozles or 3 even in your sideboard and just like really wanting to be all in on it. A lot of times it definitely has some utility. The 2 on the left are kind of like catch-alls, I guess. Fang Fighter and Cunning. So Fang Fighter, like you said, the Anakin deck, like things that are trying to play lightsabers on stuff. And Fang Fighter is good for the same reasons Bamboozle is. Sabine decks that are leaving, that are playing like Dark Sabers and General Blades, like multiple forms of equipment. And then also the like Bosk things that are trying to slap bounties on your stuff. So Fang Fighter just has a lot of utility, and it kind of like goes well in Quinlan because Quinlan doesn't like isn't doing we're not doing things like for a cause where we care about aspects. Other than force, we don't really care about types. Like we don't care about rebel type or something. We're not a Sabine deck. It's a 3 power for 3, which is pretty good rate. So it just like fits really well into the Quinlan game plan overall for dealing with stuff. And then Cunning, I know Cunning's probably also kind of a unique deck choice of mine. I like having it in the sideboard just as like a more powerful card, I guess, than whatever thing you feel like you don't need for the whatever matchup you're going against the random field of decks you might face. I just like having the power of Cunning even at 6. Like if you are casting Cunning at 6 and you've used Tarkin Town and you have board presence, right, like so many times Cunning just wins the game on the spot. And usually there's like 1 or 2 things that you, in whatever matchup you're in, you're like, yeah, this card's not as good. I would rather just have this be a Cunning. So that's kind of how I look at it. I don't have like specific decks in mind that I'm like, oh, I always said Cunning in against this. Like I said, it's just kind of like, I just like having access to it as a utility option and as kind of like a powerful thing to bring into the deck whenever I feel like it might help tilt the scales in my favor, basically.
I think Django's one probably that I'd want to side it in every time,
Mm-hmm.
just because it's such a blowout in a Django
Yeah.
at
Yeah,
6.
I sided it. I sided both copies in against Django both times I played the deck in Columbus, for sure.
Yeah, makes sense. I think this is your deck, but the main differences I have in mine is I have Fennec in the sideboard as another option to deal with like Snoke and crates and big stuff. Do you think there's room for Fennec in yours, or like what is your take on Fennec and Quinlan?
I haven't played much Fennec, but it makes sense for sure. Like, especially in those matchups that you're talking about, they're pretty grindy games. And it's like a similar concept to Han Unit, right? Like, Han Unit is basically good in Quinlan for those grindy matchups where you need like something that deals with the problematic units that for the most part you don't want your opponent to get to, but right, you can't always keep them off of every play they're gonna make. Like sometimes people are gonna play a Darth Vader on you, they're gonna play a Snoke, they're gonna play a Luke Skywalker, and so like having some additional kind of top end that trades, not trades. I mean, Fennec doesn't even trade. Same with Han Unit, but like that basically attacks effectively into those board states. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think there's definitely a reasonable theory behind that inclusion.
And I think Han and Fennec both are even better in Quinlan than in any other deck because you get the ping from playing them. So you can go one up that makes, a 7 health leader, Han's deleting, a 7 health unit, Han's deleting. Same thing with Fennec. That one damage might be the difference between her just straight up trading or her on attack ability, like clearing. So
Yep. Yep.
Quinlan
Sure.
enables those things other decks can't.
Yep. 100%.
All right, and then I think that was it. And then the last look at the list. Any famous last words? Anything you would change other than like Kira Spark Force Throw, and the Plo Koons? Any big standout or crazy plays from any of these?
I don't know if I would. I don't know what I would change, honestly. Maybe I would try to get a third Leia in the deck just because Leia was like, after Kira. Kira is like the MVP of the deck, Kira and Plo Koon. But after that, Leia was probably the MVP of the weekend for me, honestly. I don't necessarily know what I would cut for her. And like the things you can't cut are right, Ezra, Falcon, Kira, Plo Koon. Like those are the kind of like the heart and soul of the deck. So like those have to be 3 ofs in my opinion.
I think A Wing 2 needs to be a 3 of.
Yeah, yeah, fair. But I don't know. I think the funniest play was you kind of hinted at earlier was Poe for 11 in one of the Han matchups where my opponent had Millennium Falcon and 3 damage from victory, and they thought they were safe at 19, and I surprise strike Poe for 11 to end the game. So that was probably like the coolest like a finishing play that happened during the course of the week. That was a fun game. That was a cool opponent that I was playing against in that matchup. So he was a good sport about it, but that's pretty cool.
Can we talk about Falcons quick before we wrap it up?
Sure, yeah.
One big Falcon.
Mm-hmm.
Good, bad. Would you go to 2? Would you go to 0?
It's basically good against Django, right? I mean, like it's in the deck because Django Tarkin Town is prevalent. If Django Tarkin Town didn't exist, like I'm not positive Big Falcon would make the deck. But which isn't to say it's bad elsewhere. Like there's times, right, you just smuggle out a 5/5. That's what you need. It's not like it's a bad card or anything, but that's just like where it's most valuable as compared to other things you could be playing in that slot.
Right, and
I
you're
like
talking
one.
hard casting it, right? You're talking from hand,
Yeah.
ambush,
Against
clear raider.
yeah. Against Django specifically, you want to play it from hand, yeah. But against other decks like, Bosk or whatever, you run out of threats and you smuggle out a 5/5 or something. So it has some utility there. But yeah, I could see it going to 2. Or like putting one in the sideboard specifically to bring in for Django. I like having one. I liked it as a 1 of 2 because it's a 6 cost, and it's just nice to have access in like when Quinlan's not deployed. right? He pings equal to cost. So sometimes it's just nice to have access to something at each point of the curve versus like your opponent has a problematic 6 cost unit out, and you don't have a way to like ping it is annoying sometimes. So I don't know. It was fine for me as a 1-drop. I don't think I would change it necessarily. There's certainly arguments for playing them in the sideboard instead of main, playing more main. I think that's like a play preference kind of decision.
Yeah. And then Little Falcon. For me, as a Han player, Han 1 green from set 1, like Falcon's turn 1 Falcon is like I love turn 1 Falcon, right? Because I got 6 damage before you have any. But in Quinlan, I'm finding myself, I don't really want to play Falcon early. I want to play it late to close the game.
Mm-hmm.
Is that how you play it?
A lot of times, yes. It's not like an auto play on 3 resources. Like if
I'm
you
much
have
rather looking for, but I'm like Ezra or Ahsoka, I'd much rather play to set up the force throws.
Yeah, a lot of times Ezra is their better turn 3 play, or even red 3. That's not always true. Like, for instance, against Sabine sometimes, like if you successfully turn 1 their Tarkin Town, and then you have board advantage, and then you set up also like a Millennium Falcon play, and you just are like really far ahead in the damage race, that can work a lot of times. But like you said, you do have to be careful with it, mostly because if you like leave it on the board, if it sticks, you're kind of taking turn 5 Plo Koon off the table for yourself, either because you have to pay 1 to keep Falcon in play, and you can't pay for Plo on 5 resources anymore, or you return it to your hand, but then you won't have Coordinate online a lot of times. So like if you commit to Falcon early, you just have to be aware that you're probably playing Plo Koon a turn later in that scenario. So that's just kind of the drawback of it.
Yeah, and I feel like the bouncing, you're losing that board presence that you're fighting to win by letting it go. So I don't know. That's why, for me, most of the times I'm not. Sabine is probably the one matchup where it's like, yeah, because if I can Tarkin Town their 2-drop they played on ground, and then their follow-up plays an A-wing in space, right, then you can eat that immediately. So like that makes a whole lot of sense. But most other matchups, I'm probably looking for Falcon mid to late game, like post Plo.
Yeah.
To work to close the game.
Yeah, that's fair. The other scenario call out is just like Django, if you have it as like an answer to a lurking tie or something, right? Then it's doing a lot of work for you.
100%. That shuts off. I mean, you can't ping it, so and you can't Tarkin Town it, so you have to eat it with a unit. Falcon's the best one to do that with, because then you can. That's the time I want it to bounce, because then it heals itself, right? So, to eat the next lurking time.
Yep, you got it.
All right, so that's your PQ winning Quinlan list. There
it is. Hope people found this valuable, and take Quinlan for a spin and have success with it. It's a cool deck for sure. It's a fun deck to play, I guess, will be my last thing to say. Like I try to play a lot of different decks, but I've had a lot of fun playing Quinlan.
Quinlan's fun. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it. You also wrote a tournament report, so if you're interested in hearing about his weekend in Columbus, and his matchups throughout the day on his undefeated Swiss run, didn't drop a game in any match in Swiss, and only dropped 1 game in Top Cut. So, very impressive run. You can read about it on the website. It'll be linked in the description of the video. So, again, Sam, awesome. Congratulations. Great run. Super happy for you. Got that bye in Vegas. Thanks for everybody for stopping by, and we'll see you in the arenas.
Awesome. See y'all.